and we can definitely find our own rhythm in. So they kind of express in us as individuals in different ways, right? Like you could be working with a specific archetype and I could be working with the same archetype, and they come out in different ways because our psyches have different things that are in need of integration. And we've had different experiences that color how we relate to that specific archetype.
Welcome to the Reframe, where fear is brave. Today, we're going to dive into the power of working with archetypes for inner awareness, healing, and growth. This work provides profound insights into your natural strengths and challenges. And as you journey deeper into the archetype work, you learn to navigate and access new veins of personal expression and dive deeper into your conscious as well as subconscious life. We're going to be joined by Kayla Wright, a gifted guide for this process, as well as the somatic integration that is necessary afterwards. She takes us into the belly of how to work with a few important archetypes, with practical application at the end of the podcast. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Welcome to season 2 of The Reframe, where fear is brave. And today we have a very special episode. We're going to be talking about archetypes. And archetypes are really important aspects of our lives that, whether you realize it or not, we engage with and identify with on a regular basis. This is something that I use in my therapy practice, but I wanted to make sure to bring someone who speaks this language in a much more integrated and deep way to get to understand how archetypes, and understanding them, we can have a greater introspection of ourselves, our strengths, our motivations, our weaknesses, or challenges, and then other archetypes or aspects of identity that we can get to know and pull in to be able to deepen and give more texture to our lived human experience. So I'd like to introduce you to Kayla Wright, and I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And I think what you said about bringing in the archetypes that maybe we're not so familiar with to bring more texture to our lives, I think that's fundamental in what archetypal work is, because Carl Jung, who we'll get into a little bit later, was all about the individuation, right? So coming into wholeness. And, when we're just identified with the things that we're familiar with, we don't have access to this whole other part of us that is really looking for integration and therefore has the potential to just kind of bring us into a wholer, more in-depth way of living. So I really think that's a key. So archetypes in general, I think it's like really important to define what they are, because I think a lot of people think, oh, an archetype, it's like an image, or is that a person? Is it like Mother Mary? Like what are we talking about here when we're talking about archetypes? And they're really defined in many different ways, but I typically go with the Carl Jung's definition, and he is a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He typically gets credited for the foundation or finding of analytical psychology. He has had a profound influence on really integrating the deep life in psychology and what that looks like to go inward instead of focusing on what our external reality is. So archetypes, from his definition, are basically universal primal symbols and or images that across cultures, across race, across, individual human experience, every human experiences. And as such, because we all experience them, we come into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human and how to come into wholeness, how to come into integration, and just live a fuller, happier life. So
they're diving into kind of a collective unconscious architecture of different manifestations of energy, basically, or identity. Kind of like, I think I was trying to think of an easy way to explain archetypes and the Avengers villain.
yeah,
Relatable of how each one of those holds a really tangible and unique flavor, and they definitely have their strengths and they certainly have their challenges, but it's contained. It doesn't, it's not loosey goosey. And the archetypes really are uh, categories that we can tease apart and identify with.
Yeah, yeah, and we can definitely find our own rhythm in. So they kind of express in us as individuals in different ways, right? Like you could be working with a specific archetype and I could be working with the same archetype and they come out in different ways because our psyches have different things that are in need of integration and we've had different experiences that color um, how we relate to that specific archetype. But I do think you bringing up Marvels, like, that's just, like, one of the easy ones because archetypes are found, in our mythos, not just in psychology. They're found in our literature, they're found in media, art, religion, but they're not specific people. So when we think of Marvel, we think of, um, like Wonder Woman or Captain America, those aren't archetypes. Those are characters playing an archetype. So the archetype is the deeper role or manifestation that Captain America slips into and projects for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So it's like the hero heroine's journey, so that's one foundational archetype that has been represented in our culture in like thousands of different ways just in the last like decade.
Could you just briefly talk a little bit? You had mentioned about if say, pick the mother, right? Or the hero even. And if two people are working with the hero archetype, you had mentioned that because you had different life experiences and I've had different life experiences, how is that showing up differently for people?
Yeah, so with the hero archetype in specific, it's good to consider, let's see how I want to offer this. It's it's good to consider what the potential healing effect of working with that archetype could be, right? So why are we working with the hero archetype? And it's typically for specifically the hero, it's to come into more congruence with our life purpose. It's to come into more congruence with who we are as individuals. And so that looks like working through our personal fears, right? And so your fears are going to be different than my fears. So this is kind of where the hero's journey can be very, it's like a map, but it's so different because you might be journeying through the forest and I'm journeying through the desert. And it's just going to look different as a result. But we're still both on a hero's journey, and they're going to still have similar characteristics of like fighting the inner demon and, conquering the demon and coming into more courage and coming into more capacity to like know what our purpose is or where we're going. And then it starts all over again, and so you can always just go a little deeper every cycle. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I think it would be helpful to understand maybe some of these archetypes, just so people have a reference point of what we're talking about.
Like specific foundational archetypes and their potentials? Okay, so like I was saying, I think before we wanna dive into all of that, I just wanted to bring in where I've gotten a lot of my archetypal knowledge from. It has been Carl Jung, but it's also been Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And one of the things that she says is that archetypes usually of one story usually represent one person's psyche. So that's not always, she's not saying it's always that way, but in most stories, every character that enters the story, the movie, is an archetype of one person's psyche. So your personal psyche. So you're not just the hero, you're also the villain, right? And the villain is usually someone who's in our shadow because we're like, no, I'm the hero. I want to be the hero of the story, but that shadow aspect is also part of our story. And that's also where we can get a lot of healing. So I just wanted to preface that because the whole idea of working with archetypes is for spiritual integration. It is for coming into wholeness. It is for that specific um, aim that Carl Jung had about individuation. I mean, he says that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who we truly are. And that is through integrating the shadow as well as the light. So with that, unless you have anything to say, I'll just start getting into like the different archetypes. There are so many archetypes. So the ones that I say here are not going to be like, these are the 5 archetypes that exist in the world. There are so many. But I think these are just like really big ones that exist in our culture today. And so are very, are very relevant to talk about. So the hero and the heroine, right? We just spoke about that. I'll go a little bit deeper, but it's like about overcoming adversity. These are some of the healing potentials. Like if you were to sit down and say, I want to do some integration work, and you were to ask yourself, like, what are you integrating? Consider like what their journey represents as I speak about all these archetypes, and that's who you'll want to work with in the future, or for your work. So with the hero or the heroine, it's about overcoming adversity. It's about coming into our own personal growth, our individuation. It's usually about like leaving the home, finding ourselves, like all of that. It's this huge journey. I think of like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings or something like that, where it's just like, I'm going off on my own now. See you later. And then there's usually a coming home, and that can happen like over and over and over again. And then there's another archetype, which I like split up into 4 different sub-archetypes maybe. And it is the archetype of the victim and the perpetrator, and as well as the savior and the white knight, because they usually all kind of come together in that story. And when we're working with specifically the victim and the perpetrator archetypes, we are also working with, our sense of power or our sense of powerlessness, because either we are the perpetrator or either we are the victim or we're a blend of both, And so there's like some healing that needs to be done in those archetypes as well. And I also wrap in the savior and the white knight because I do feel like in those stories, think of Disney, right? Like there's that victim perpetrator storyline, but there's always the white knight or the savior. So there's that kind of learning to be a home unto ourselves and coming back into our power, into our right power, into our aligned power, our autonomy, our individuality. So for people who are really feeling a lot of aggression in their life, maybe they would want to work with the perpetrator victim archetype just to see where the balance needs to happen. Or vice versa, maybe someone's feeling very powerless in their life and they need to come into some insight into, how that's continually happening over and over and over again, because that's usually what it is. There's a cycle that's going on, and these archetypes can help draw us out of the cycle, give us insight, and help us to affect change in our life that will affect the archetype we're embodying. Because essentially that's what we're doing. We're embodying these archetypes, whether we know it or not, like you said earlier. And then there's the divine feminine, the divine masculine. And there's like hundreds of gods and goddesses and just wise women and wise men and, like all of that fall under this umbrella. But if we're just to think about the divine feminine and the divine masculine and what like healing potentials there are, for the divine feminine, it's usually coming into our emotionality, learning how to be more receptive, learning how to be with our intuition, learning the balanced approach to giving and receiving, what it means to surrender and nurture and allow, what it means to be like fierce and embodied, but not domineering, And then for the divine masculine or the divine father, there's that structure, that assertiveness, the accountability, the leadership, the proactivity, whereas, the divine feminine is more like receptive. And this isn't to say that only women need to work with divine feminine and only men need to work with divine masculine. These are two archetypes that live, once again, inside of the human being. So really it's about coming into congruence with ourselves. Like, are we more embodying our divine feminine, and do we need a little bit more structure in our life? If so, we would start working with the divine masculine, right? To uncover the aspects that are like not quite balanced within us, to bring harmony and union so that we're whole and one and there's no more duality, separation.
Mm.
And then the last one I just want to touch on that I think is really up in our world and our sphere right now, just with this whole like boom in spirituality, is the alchemist or the sage or the medicine woman or the shaman, and this one is all about like spiritual authority. I feel like in today's world, or just a couple years ago, decades ago, I should say, like spiritual authority really came from an outside source, right? It really came from the church or a man or an institution. And when we work with these archetypes, we're really learning about how to connect to our own divinity through our own direct gnosis. And that can look and feel very different for many people. Yeah, I feel like I just like gave you a bunch of information. So
Absolutely. It helps to have a little definition to those. And you're right, those are some really um, strong archetypes that we have that we live by. And it's interesting to consider that we actually are engaging with these so profoundly on a day-to-day identity base without even really realizing. Something that I've noticed that certainly speak to this more information. But anytime there is an archetype, just as it shows that our strengths or our challenges, but it also can be overdeveloped or underdeveloped, has a shadow side to each of them. Can you speak a little bit to what that might look like and what is and what that?
yes. And let's define shadow. The shadow is our unconscious, right? So if it's unconscious, we don't really know about it. And that's why working with archetypes is great, because another quote from Carl Jung is, "The archetype is a force. It has an autonomy all on its own that can wrest the individual out of his rationality and submerge him." So really, what's happening here is the archetype is coming in. We're like inviting it in by getting into stillness, by getting into like a meditative state. And then we're allowing the symbols, the images, the feelings to kind of be projected through that archetype. And then what we see is kind of what's inside of us. Whereas if we tried to just like go in there and like figure out what's hidden, like we're not going to find it. We're really like our minds are very skilled at, keeping the unconscious unconscious and keeping the conscious conscious. And so the archetype really, it's like when you're in a movie, you go to a movie and then like you're just submerged. You're no longer you. It's a practice to remember that you're sitting in the movie theater watching a movie. You kind of become the movie at times. So I really think it's important to know that when we work with archetypes, it's like a container. And you're going in like deeper into yourself through a very like conscious, safe, and, malleable kind of way. So when we talk about the shadow, we're talking about the aspects that, we set this intention like, oh, I want to work with the hero, and I want to figure out what my life purpose is. And then so we start to do all this work and then we get triggered or something, and we see where our fear takes over, or, we get a little tripped up and a little too self-critical, or, we become our worst enemy. And those are the shadow pieces that we weren't necessarily aware of, but we become more aware of them as we journey deeper into that archetype, because the whole journey is about making it through to the end and like integrating the place in you that keeps you cut off from your life purpose. If that was the intention, right? The intention is to figure out my life purpose. And then you find out, like, I can't get there because this giant rage fest inside of me or this giant self critical person just like emanates out of me and stifles me, or like that's the shadow right there. And that's the potential for so much. Uh, that's the potential for so much life force energy to be regained and for you to start living beyond it by doing some of that inner child work or doing some of the shadow work that is required to go on. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. And what came up for me while you were speaking was I think it's important to recognize that it's not, you were inviting in not just a stream of consciousness, but a lot of information in data and energy very specific to that archetype. I liked how you said it's not just going inside and trying to figure it out on your own. You're actually calling and harnessing an entire subconscious, unconscious vein of energy that will help to take you on that journey, that whatever that inner journey is, and whichever archetype you're working with has a different flavor. And embodying that frequency will help. All right. Can you speak to that just a little bit and helping people understand that it's not just a concept here when working with an archetype? Because I think even when we're telling stories and we see the archetypes, the stories, we get stuck in our head. And it's not as much here as it is in full-bodied experience.
Yes, I love this question because I'm a somatic practitioner, and this is like archetypes is one of the big tools that I use, but somatics is really, my passion. And specifically, archetypal work is somatic work because you can't think yourself through a journey. This isn't like getting out a piece of paper and writing like, I'm going to work with the hero's journey and this is what it's going to look like. Yeah, you can map it out a little, but the archetypes really, I love that you said that they are a vein that you're tapping into that has like just so much data. It has so much data beyond our personal consciousness. And this is really where Carl Jung's work is so pivotal, is because he really believed in the collective unconscious. And what's happening here is these archetypes exist across all cultures. They're not just born out of one specific culture. All the different cultures that we all have representations of these archetypes. And as a result, when we start to deepen into that and call on all that data, we're not just getting information from our own body, we're actually getting information from the collective DNA of our ancestors, of our spiritual lineage. So this doesn't mean that it has to be like blood lineage. Like these archetypes have carried, they're ancient, they kind of, I think they go beyond human culture, but I don't know. I'm not like an archaeologist and I'm not like a neuroscientist, so I have no idea. But yeah, they really are something that brings us deeper into our body if we allow it. And that's the piece that I do feel like a lot of people struggle with, because archetypal work is not beginner's work. I really think that there needs to be a foundation set, especially for people who have experienced trauma or are just beginning to understand and like untangle whatever's going on inside of their minds. There needs to be a foundation where they've been able to practice how to hold space for themselves so that when these things arise, like the powerlessness, like the anger, like Kali Ma, who just is this like rageful destroyer of the divine feminine, like when those things arise, we don't shrink and become them, but we allow their energy to kind of like move through the body, and we feel the anger, we feel the pent up rage, or we feel the grief that's under there, and we allow it to like let it move the energy in our body via crying, via shaking, via stillness, if stillness is what we need, dancing, moving, making weird sounds, like writing, if writing is the thing that comes. And it's not about linearly, that's a hard word for me, holding the thread. It's about just allowing the experience to come up and through. And so that container is important because you need to set the intention, you need to give yourself time, and then you need to come out of it in a safe way. And then you need to integrate it for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes afterwards. And if there's more work there, more anger, more rage, more whatever processing needs to happen, it's just an invitation to go deeper. But there's no force that's happening because this isn't something you can control. It's literally just a tool to get you out of the story of your identity, the story of your trauma, the story of who you think you are, and submerge you, dismantle your ego so that you can rearrange yourself. I kind of think of like a caterpillar in its little uh, cocoon. Yeah, it's chrysalis and it's like pupating and like getting all messy. Like that's kind of what this process is. The caterpillar isn't in there like sorting its bones out. It's literally just turning to mush and it'll rearrange itself later. But like that's the process of archetypal work. And so I really think, you know, not not just not just attacking it or coming to it from that linear aspect of I want to know my life purpose and then think it's going to happen like right then and there. Like there's a whole wealth of knowledge inside of you and there's usually a lot of blocks that we need to kind of like integrate to arrive at that full intention manifesting, I guess.
I like that you highlighted creating a foundation and a container for safety
Yeah.
because a lot you're asking in this work, you're asking the individual to go into the unknown, very much so. And that can be really scary, I mean, in itself. And
Yeah.
it's not that it's unknown by nature. How do you suggest people create that foundation and sense of safety before they really uh, surrender to the process of integrating and experiencing and inviting in those archetypal energies?
Yeah. I think that's a really great question because working with an archetype, it isn't just like a one and done thing. You're not just like, I'm going to integrate this hero's journey today and tomorrow I'm going to be great. It really can take years. It can take months depending on how intently you yourself. And you can't just dive into the deep end when beginning. Like archetypal work is built in progression. And the practice that we'll talk about at the end of the episode is like a great way to just kind of start learning how to set a container and how to foster a relationship with the archetype, because this is the key thing for me. When you're working with an archetype, you're not just working with an idea, you're working with like an actual energy, like we were talking about. And it has initiations, for you to work with that particular archetype. It's not just going to be like, okay, you asked for it, like, here you go. It's going to require that you build resiliency so that you know how to take care of yourself and you know when to back off and you know when to integrate and then come back to the work, right? So I think before anyone even tries to set up for archetypal work, they really need to ask themselves, like, am I supported? Do I have the tools to enter this kind of deep medicine? Do I need someone to help me? Do I want a friend or a practitioner just to be there for me to talk to you about? Do I have the self-sufficiency and the self-regulatory skills to get to my edge of comfortability and even get beyond my comfort zone a little and then regulate my nervous system so that I don't lose myself in the energies that kind of come through? Because when you are working with archetypes, say you do hit that triggered zone and you feel all this like grief or agonizing despair or anger, you don't want to go out into the world and like be that, because that's what's happening is now you've called on this archetype, and so it's living in your nervous system. It's living in your tissues. And if you don't know how to bring yourself back to your own sense of self and set the work down, exit the container, you're going to be unconsciously spewing that unhealed part of the archetype, unhealed shadow into the world around you. And that can be very destructive. So I do think there's like the base layer of like, am I ready for this? Finding the support you need. And then as far as like setting the container, I like to use the divine feminine and the divine masculine archetype here, because the divine masculine is the container, right? This is the work we're going to do. It defines the edges. It says, we're going to do this for this long. I'm going to see what comes. I'm going to set an intention. I'm going to be done at this time, and that's that. And I'll do it again tomorrow, or I'll do it again in a week. So it's very structured. And then the divine feminine comes in, and this is where like we receive the archetype, and we set the intention, we state the intention, and then we allow ourselves the time for it to arise in whatever capacity it's going to arise in. And we're just open, receptive to the experience. So we set the container of this is how long I want the practice to be. And then like maybe it's just a 1-day thing, or maybe it's like a 9-week thing. Every week you do it once a week or something for an hour. And then you give yourself the time to kind of like set down the structure in that time frame and see what comes through, whether it's dance, movement, meditations, journeying. There's a whole way of working with archetypes, and we can get into that in a second. But that's like the structure that I would approach beginning to work with an archetype, because you want to establish that relationship, because it is a force that is moving through you.
Let's move into some of the ways that we can work with the integration piece of it. So going through that experience, but then what is integration? Integration is such an important part.
Yeah.
Of therapy or plant medicine or any kind of subconscious work.
Yes.
And it can get forgotten or maybe not taken as seriously, because it has a place that's really important to be able to do the actual transformation, inner transformation.
Yeah, I agree. I think integration is really necessary, not just in archetypal work, in yoga and meditation. I mean, even in yoga, like at the end of a traditional yoga class, you lay down in Shavasana and you integrate the practice. You let the body rest and let the energies settle into the body before you move out into your day. It's kind of the same with, therapy, archetypal medicine, somatic work, meditations, like anything you're doing. So that piece of integrating, I think it's doubled in archetypal work. I really think that someone should, if they're spending an hour a week, let's just say they're spending an hour a week diving into it, and they've said, I'm going to do it for 9 weeks. That's their container. I really think that they should allow like 3 weeks of integration, and it should be throughout the 9-week container. Does that make sense? So that they're not like, they're doing like 2 journeys and then they're taking a break to let the energy move through them on week 3. And then on week 4, they're starting the 3rd week of their 9-week journey, and they're breaking it up so that they're not just diving in with all this, like, I'm gonna break through my shadow and integrate my thing. That force energy is needed for sure, because that's our courage, that's our capacity, that's our will, that's the energy that's needed to alchemize and create transformation. But if you have too much of that, you're gonna blow out the nervous system, and sometimes, especially with archetypal work, what you see, sometimes you might just be laying on the floor and you might not really see much. You might be feeling more. You might have journaled a little. But then it's like, what follows over the next couple of days? What are you dreaming about? How are you feeling as you navigate the world? Like, how are you thinking about the food you're eating or the places you're going or the friends that you have? What is starting to shift in your mind? That's the integration work with archetypal work is after you've done the work in the container, how is it actually influencing subtly the rest of your life? And if we're not paying attention to that, we're missing 90% of what archetypal work really is. Because not every journey is going to be very like meditative and you're seeing stuff in your inner eye or something. Not every journey is like that. Sometimes you really you're just kind of moving or shaking or feeling emotions and you're not really sure what's going on. And it all kind of builds up on one another throughout the journey. So that integration piece is pretty important. And I think it's where most of the medicine comes in because it's archetypal, it's symbology, it's the language of the soul. This isn't defining the story that has happened to you. This is uncovering the deeper roots of why that story even began in the beginning or why you even had that trauma experience in the beginning.
I mean, we'll think of actually what it creates space for. Without that process of time and integration, we forget that we live our day-to-day lives based on the patterning and from everything before. So when we go in whatever modality you're using and intentionally kind of shake things up and bring in new qualities to yourself, and then you're allowing your body to, like, your tastes change, the way you hold your body changes,
Mhm.
your voice changes. And and taking the time after the integration and part of the integration of creating space in ways that you would never even think of that you need to create space for these new parts of yourself to bubble up and become an active part of your life.
Yeah. And they will still be things you need to practice because just because you've integrated it and allowed it now to bubble up, oh, I'm getting something really good. Okay. So when you go into the container, like you're trying to dive into the unconscious, and that can be hard sometimes. And so then the integration is you've kind of left like a hole in your unconscious. And that's where, through the integrative process, that's where it starts to bubble up and forward into your consciousness, where you can then be like, oh, I see, this is what I need to change in my life. And this is what I need to practice. And just depending on whatever archetype you're working with, this could look different. But let's just say it's powerlessness. Oh, instead of shrinking in these situations, I need to learn how to be in my body and not dissociate. So it's like through the integration practice, it starts to bubble up, like you said. And that is where the archetypal work really happens. It's not the journey. The journey is just the opening, the journey is just the container. And the rest of it is you're just letting it come up and through you so that you can access some of that unconsciousness and bring it up into consciousness. It's an act of bringing light to the shadow, bringing light to the darkness. And it's not just going to be like one and done, you know? Our unconscious is like the majority of our psyche. So it's a lifelong process at this point. And that's what I love about archetypal work is once you've established your story and you've done some therapy and you've got the groundwork and you know who you are and you're ready to shift things around in your life because you want to grow, that's where archetypal work really comes in because it's no longer about the story. We're not trying to understand the story. We're actually trying to get beyond the story and get beyond who we've been so that we can create more space in our life and become who it is we feel like we want to become.
Is there anything that we haven't touched on before we dive into how people can proactively work with archetypes?
There was something that you said about the integration process that I think it was Clarissa Pinkola Estes again. She says, yeah, I think it's in her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves, but she She talks about how an archetype really it, like, becomes your bones and it becomes your blood as you work with it, and that's because when you read a story or you watch a movie about, the hero's journey or whatever it is, you walk away after that feeling like that person for a time because you've given that energy to yourself, you've given yourself over to that energy, and now the energy is pouring through you and moving through you. And I think that's a very important touchstone just when you're working with an archetype is when you set the container, you're like mixing with the image. Your consciousness is mixing with that symbol or that mythos, and you're becoming the wolf for a time. You're becoming the hero for a time. And in that process, a lot is happening subconsciously. And just to remember that you're consciously working with an archetype opens up the space for all of that wisdom to come up and out rather than just like you go to a movie and then you're kind of like in this hypnotic state where you're like in the story and just living it out. When you're working with archetypes specifically, there's just this more intentionality. And so you actually notice like when you're playing out certain aspects and when you're kind of shying away or hiding or like missing your shadow or looking the other way, and that's all part of the process. And it does get deeper and deeper over time. But I don't know, I just felt like it was important to share that.
Yeah, and to take it just maybe a step further, what I saw when you were speaking to that was when you work with an archetype and you build relationship with that archetype, and it becomes a familiar, it becomes a friend, it becomes an ally.
Mhm.
Who, for those of us that are in environments where we hold space for other people, being able to breathe in that archetype and the container is in the space of the room. So other people can step into that feel and work with that specific, whether it's the mother or the
Right.
sage or uh, that we and I think our left head brain and the way that we have been raised is everybody's isolated, and we very much aren't. That as each of us are doing the healing work and being able to tap into and identify with and cultivate our own inner world with whichever archetype you're working with, we naturally have influence in a positive way on those around us. So whether it's in your home with your kiddos or your
Yeah.
partner, your furry friends at work, that you really start having a ripple effect when you start diving into what you're talking about.
Yeah, because all in all, like working with archetypes involves recognizing the patterns in ourselves and then using these tools, using these allies, these things for psychological and spiritual growth and evolution, right? And so it is getting beyond our sense of self and remembering that we aren't really our bodies. We aren't really our thoughts. We're not our feelings. We're not the experiences we have in our life. We are something so much more numinous than that. I think that's the right word. And once once you cross the threshold of just living life as thinking that you're the thoughts inside your head and thinking you're the emotions that you feel and the experiences you feel, once you cross that threshold and you do the work, the inner work, and you start to come into, oh, that's a thought that is just here, you're no longer identified with the people, the places, the thoughts, the feelings that you are. And I think that's the biggest medicine of archetypal work is you're getting beyond your attachments because really, as far as I've journeyed, and I still have a long way to go, as far as I've journeyed is we aren't who we think we are. We aren't what we think we are. And the archetypes really give us the space to set down the things that we are carrying that no longer serve us so that we can just become more love, more light, more presence, more peace in this world. And I think that's really the aim of archetypal medicine is like shedding the layers so that we can just be who we are, and who really knows what that is? Like, really.
Did you want to just briefly go over how one could intentionally work with in ceremony with the different archetypes or their chosen archetype?
Yeah. Yeah, I would love that. I do want to caveat that there are many ways to work with archetypes. And once you start working with an archetype, you're going to find your flavor. You're going to find what works for you. So this is just a doorway in. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't, but if it doesn't work, try another way, like don't close yourself off to the experience. So it's just getting to know an archetype because it is a relationship. So instead of just going into it with the goal of integrating shadow or finding your life's purpose, it's really actually setting a container to have a relationship, a working relationship with an energy that is wanting to work with you at this time. Just like you would work with an oracle deck or tarot, it's really about cultivating that relationship first. So when we get in ceremony, there's just a couple like practical container steps that I like to do. And I like to name the archetype that I'm trying to connect with. So just maybe on a piece of paper, writing down, today my intention is to work with or connect with Great Mother or the alchemist inside of me, whatever. So you name the archetype and then your intention, whether it's to work with it, get to know it, open yourself up to it, your intention. I trust that you know how to make intentions. And then you find stillness, right? So this is coming into 5 minutes of grounding, like really getting out of your head. What does this mean? What does this look like? What am I going to do? Like dropping it all and bringing yourself down into your heart, into your womb, into your feet, like establishing a connection and stillness, empty presence. And then from here, without going back up into your mind, so staying with your breath, staying with your body, listing out the characteristics of this archetype that you are already aware of. Maybe you don't know any, so you might want to do some research or something, but just see if you can actually conjure something within yourself first. Don't overthink it. Really just let this stuff like stream of consciousness come out. And then once again, take a breath when your list is done. Circle the ones that you resonate with, that you feel like you're typically embodying. Star the ones that you'd like to learn from or embody more of. And then underline any of the darker qualities that maybe you're like, I don't identify with that, because that's where the medicine is, because we need to really come into congruence with the whole archetype. And then you'll find stillness again. So after you've underlined, circled, and starred, and then you'll go through that list and then you'll start to name it out loud. I like to say it out loud because it really vibrates through my soul, through my body, through my tissues. But you can say it internally if you want. But you'll just say those characteristics out loud and notice in your body where you feel it, what the sensation is. Is there grief? Is there excitement? Is there energy? Is there numbness? Where in the body are you feeling it? And I think that's the biggest piece of this whole practice, is identifying where in your body you may feel the sensation of this particular archetype. And then once that is over, I would just get still again, thank your body, thank yourself for your presence. And then the integration piece is getting out a piece of paper and kind of like stream of consciousness, just like asking the question, writing the question down, like, Great Mother, who are you? And then letting Great Mother kind of just like answer it as if you were writing the response as Great Mother. Let it come through you in the way that it wants to. Nothing might come. And then just ask several different questions. Who are you? What do you want me to learn? What are you here to teach me? What are you here to show me? Just kind of get a little playful with it and see if anything comes. And then the last piece would be to build an altar. If it's something that you really want to work through or with for an extended period of time, like a couple weeks. or a whole lunar cycle or a couple lunar cycles. Yeah. So that would be my suggestion on how to begin opening up the space.
I think that's a really, really beautiful way to, and accessible. I think most people are able to do what you just described and will be surprised on what comes up. It's really amazing when you tap into the subconscious and you just relax back that sense of control and are open to what bubbles up.
Yeah, I think that's really important too because the answers are always inside of us. And so, we get information from other people, right? I didn't just get all this archetypal information from within. I studied some Jungian psychology and I've taken courses and like all this stuff. And it can come through me. And when I allow it to come through me and I don't feel like I have to have like all the understanding, that's when I can start to practice just what it means to work with an archetype and let it grow organically rather than like through control and effort and pressure. And I need to know it all before I go in. You're never going to know it all. So trust the answers you find within yourself and let it lead you because it will.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for the place that you're playing in the world and being willing to come in and share your wisdom and your knowledge with everybody here.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a really good conversation. I don't ever get to like talk about it in depth like this, so it was like really fun to just kind of nerd out with you. So I appreciate you holding this space, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the other episodes that you have.
Yeah,
I miss episode. Yeah.
there's some pretty amazing humans coming up as well.
Yeah.
I'll make sure that all of the contact information, how people can reach out to you are in the episode notes. But if there's anybody listening right now that this really resonates with, oftentimes when we're talking about deep subconscious, especially archetypical work, my experience is that if it really resonates with somebody, sometimes there's a very profound physical response, like listening to the episode and crying or goosebumps the entire time. If there's somebody in that place right now, but is a little bit like reserved or not sure because it's so foreign, what would you say to them? What would be your words of wisdom to them?
If you're feeling those feelings, those sensations, it's already active and it's already working within you. And there's nothing you have to do. There's nothing you have to chase. You don't have to go and find the next step. It will find you and it will coax you safely into more depth. So if there is that reservation, that's you, like, it's active in you. It's moving through you already, and it will find you. And it will come to you, and you don't have to, like, force it. Trust your reservation. Trust the instincts you're getting. Like, is it a yes? Is it a no? That is your nervous system already opening up to the work.
Kayla, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hope you have a nice day. Thank you for having me.
The holy in me sees the holy in you. The wounded in me sees the wounded in you. As Ram Dass says, we are all on a journey of walking each other home. Thank you for joining us, and it would mean a lot if you would follow, subscribe, and share this episode or podcast with someone that you know it is right for. Make sure to look at the episode notes for your 12-page lunar cycle download. This is a quick, easy-to-use reference in working with the monthly lunar energies rather than against them. And until next time, be well.